Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining us today here on Point of View. We're going to focus some time and attention for a few minutes on Africa. And if you've listened to any of the programs we've done in the last couple of months, you know, we've had Kathy Dudley on here, Amani Bridges talking about the need for leadership in Nigeria, for example. This weekend I was with somebody who's been a missionary most of her life in Kenya. Talked about leadership there. Some of my staff, for example, have been to places like Liberia and Uganda and a variety of other places around Africa. And it is exciting to see how the body of Christ is expanding. But there is such a need for training pastors, providing leadership, and that's why I'm just so thrilled that we can bring to the microphone individual that serves as the executive director of Leadership Vistas. Was called to that ministry back in 2016. Before that, served with a ministry I think very highly of, Marketplace Chaplains. And we'll talk more about that. But also as an individual, graduated from West Point, has served in the military for a while. So thank you for your service, as well as has a MA degree from Hollins College in Roanoke, Virginia, a graduate of Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and soon to be Dr. Andy Bunn, who is getting his PhD in leadership from Piedmont International University. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
It is so good to have you here. And let's, if we can, maybe talk about how you ended up there, because obviously this is an organization that we want to feature. You can go to leadershipvistas.org. We have a link there. One of the things I always encourage you to do is watch the video. Now, it's about a 5-minute video, but there you can watch it, learn a great deal about Leadership Vistas, and then up on the right-hand corner is a share button. So would you take the time to watch it, click that button, then put it on your Facebook page, Twitter. Maybe you know a pastor, I'm sure you do, or a missions pastor, or somebody else that needs to know about this conversation, and so send that to them by email. But for those people that haven't watched the video yet, although that's the assignment for everybody listening right now, give us a little bit of a background on Leadership Vistas.
Well, Leadership Vistas, we equip African church leaders to fulfill God's will. We train church leaders.
Sure.
And it was begun several years ago by Jerry Brown, the founder, and his wife, Jolynn. And they took a trip, or Jerry did, in the 90s, and the Lord just took hold of his heart, and he wanted to formalize it even more. And in the early 2000s, was led to establish and found Leadership Vistas International Ministries. And for many years, many trips, short-term mission trips to train church leaders, he led them well. And in the last few years, decided to allow the Lord to find someone to take up the helm and continue. And I happen to be the gentleman that has the privilege to take that step now. And it was very clear a few years ago, after many years with Marketplace Chaplains, which I truly enjoyed and learned so much from and grew just greatly. But it was clear the Lord was calling me to this ministry. And so on November 1st of 2016, I heeded that call, and it's just been an outstanding journey of trusting the Lord, following his leadership, and seeing his great work, both here in the U.S., but so much so in Africa.
When people go to the website, and again, it's leadershipvistas.org, and you can, of course, watch the interview right now on either our feed that's on pointofview.net, or also we're on Facebook Live, so you can watch it either place. Matter of fact, at Facebook Live, if you want to leave some comments, we'll read those a little bit later. There's a section there on where we serve. So talk about the geographical location where a lot of this service is taking place right now.
Primarily in Eastern Central Africa. Our hub for the last several years, and since I've had the privilege to lead it, has been in Uganda, Kabale and Kasese primarily.
Yes.
We've been there several times, and what we have done is we go in for a 4-day conference of training both men and women church leaders. And through the hub of Kabale and Kasese, we have had leaders from all over Eastern and Central Africa join us. And for instance, Kenya, Burundi, the Congo, different places, and usually a couple hundred to a little more each time that we're able to train with at least 3 courses for men and women by highly trained and called instructors that choose to go on short-term mission trips with us. Well,
and again, you're getting your PhD in leadership, so you certainly bring that to the table. But, of course, all of your experience at Marketplace Chaplains and other things are helpful. And talk about that for just a minute, because a lot of us here, we take for granted so much. Matter of fact, lately I've been talking about some of the books they've translated into Spanish, for example, economics and Islam, things like that. And I find that we have this abundance of blessing. Matter of fact, next hour we'll have Jerry Tuma in talking about how to think about finances from a biblical point of view. You go to other countries, those kinds of things that we take for granted here don't exist. And leadership is one of those. I mean, most people in America have been around leaders. They've heard leadership talks. Maybe they even have Bibles or books that they've read over the years on leadership. But you go to Africa, there is a crying and significant need, isn't there?
Absolutely. And not only in general for leadership, but particularly what we've been called to do in training church leaders, pastors, because what traditionally happens is wonderful organizations, evangelical ministries go in, evangelize, share the gospel, and many come to know Christ, and that's just a great thing.
Yes.
And due to the tribal climate and different things in the smaller towns and even larger cities, the most prominent man usually is given a Bible and said, "Here,
you're the teacher,
and
you're the pastor, you're the spiritual leader."
Exactly,
right. I've seen that,
and they're really not equipped.
That's true.
To take that on. And so, what the Lord has called us to do at Leadership Vistas is come alongside them, give them some baseline theology, some pastoral care, some pastoral leadership training, and it is amazing what God has done through that. And watching each individual leader get trained, they sit there and they are totally engaged.
I was going to say they will travel for hours just to come and hear what we would maybe say. I'll get to it next time.
It doesn't matter if it's 9 o'clock in the morning or if it's 1:30 right after lunch. They are completely engaged.
Of course.
And I remember talking to one pastor who shared with me, and it hit me so hard. The stories you hear about what they go through every day with persecution, whether it be physical from the rebels that may come and just shoot up a church or a home at any time, or whether it's just the climate and the different things that happen. And one particular pastor came to me once, and they were having what they call a famine, not a drought. They call it famine. And men particularly were just dying in their town. And he wanted me to pray with him, so I did. And his story was that people were coming to his church, and even at his church, he didn't have anything physical, no money, nothing to give them. All he could give them was Jesus.
Yeah.
And he said it just like he just smiled as soon as he said it, but you could tell his heart ached and my heart ached, because that's what they go through.
Yeah.
And so what we do in sharing, training, teaching, also helps them, I think, in being able to deal with all types of situations that they otherwise wouldn't be prepared for. But I can tell you, all of them, almost to the person, will tell you that everything, as far as they're concerned, is about Jesus.
We're going to take a break and talk a little bit more about how you can get involved with Leadership Vistas, but we need to take a break. Andy Bunn with us. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
We're a divided country, but it may be worse than we imagined. An article in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences discussed what is called motive attribution asymmetry. That's a technical term for the assumption that your ideology is based in love and your opponent's is based on hate. Put another way, we're the good guys, they're the bad guys. They discovered that the average Republican and the average Democrat today are as divided as the Palestinians and Israelis. In his op-ed in the New York Times, Arthur Brooks says we see the other side as an enemy with whom one cannot negotiate or compromise. He comes to this startling conclusion. People often say that our problem in America is incivility or intolerance. He says that's incorrect. Motive attribution asymmetry leads to something far worse, contempt, which is a noxious brew of anger and disgust. And it is made worse by what he calls the outrage industrial complex that oftentimes caters to one side and criticizes the other. Now, when people hear about political conflicts, they often prescribe the wrong solutions. Just because we disagree doesn't mean we should put aside our disagreements. Arthur Brooks instead says that we need not disagree less. Instead, we need to disagree better. Whether we're discussing politics, economics, or philosophy, we should engage in a robust competition of ideas. We can disagree without being so disagreeable. So he suggests 2 steps. First, turn away from what he calls the rhetorical dope peddlers. These are powerful people on your side who are profiting from the culture of contempt. Second, make a commitment never to treat others with contempt. Christians should be civil and gracious. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And he's been with us today, and he is the Executive Director of Leadership Vistas International. If you go to leadershipvistas.org, you can find some great information. And let's, if we can, see if we can get you some volunteers, maybe even staff members, who knows. But we've talked about where you serve. And so when you go to the website, that's the first button on the left. And that will give you a little bit of a geographical orientation. People fail to realize how large Africa is. And so to one of my African missionary friends the other day, I found a picture where they had the map of Africa, and in it they put most of Europe, all of the United States, and a variety of other countries, just to show you this is huge. And, of course, the need is very great, as you would point out. But let's talk about the second button there, which is Take Action, because there are mission trips. There are opportunities to volunteer, and most importantly, of course, you want people to pray for you. So let's take each one of those individually. What about mission trips? I know right now there's some churches, maybe even Sunday school classes saying, I'd like to do a mission trip, maybe a short-term one. And they may not even know there is such a group called Leadership Vistas. But if they would like to partner with you and join with you, what does that entail?
Well, we try to do 2 short-term mission trips a year with the 4-day conferences in 2 locations. So over 2 weeks, about 17 days.
Yes.
And we take a team of anywhere from 12 to 18, and they have administrative tasks to some degree. A lot are instructors for what we teach.
Right.
And so anyone who might have some qualifications to actually teach both men and women different aspects of what our curriculum would be, that would be most helpful with joining in with us. And then along with that, anyone who would just appreciate the experience of learning more about what mission work is about and how engaging the African church leaders in particular are, and how just hungry they are for the Word of God, and then for sharing it and making the continent of Africa that much smaller in that way, because not only do they want to take it to their churches and use what they're taught, but they really have a calling to do even more. And it's very evident with all the ones that we have the privilege to train. So anyone who would be interested, we welcome them going to our website and contacting us through that and letting us know. And our next major one will be in the fall, the end of September through mid-October.
Yes. And again, when you talk about credentials, I recognize that I have a friend that teaches leadership at the Cox School of Business at SMU. Well, obviously, they're very qualified. But, I would have to say that some people that maybe have just read a couple of John Maxwell books on leadership might be way ahead of the individuals that we're going to be taught in Africa. So, and again, like you said, you don't necessarily have to be a teacher. There's administrative opportunities. There's just all sorts of things. And it really is just a great vision trip as well, if somebody can take the time to go out there and spend some time in Africa.
Absolutely. Yes, sir. We welcome all.
So that's the missions trip. Now, volunteers, I know that you have a need even in the office as well, and event coordination, all sorts of other things. So what would be available there?
Well, we have one major event a year right now, planning to have a second one later in the year.
Okay.
Our fundraising dinner is coming up in April.
Okay.
Standing firm as leaders for his kingdom is the thing. And so anyone who would like to be a part of that and volunteer to help us, we would welcome it, because we still need about 10 to 12 to help us actually carry that out.
Yes.
And then throughout the year, just in doing our traditional office kind of activities and preparation, anyone who'd like to help us out with that, we would welcome them coming. And so we could share with them, they could share with us, and we could grow together in what the Lord is allowing to happen through Leadership Vistas.
Let's give them the date in April, because somebody might even want to buy a table or something like that. So
okay. Absolutely. It's April 30th, and it's at the Hope Center, which is
very simple.
Us, along with 40-plus other evangelical nonprofit ministries, benefit greatly from June Hunt, who built that building for that purpose, and it's just been an excellent experience for us.
Well, it has been for us as well. I start my day at Probe on the second floor, come on over here, and then head back there a little bit later. And we've had Sue Bailey here going through the various ministries out there, so that's certainly one of the things that we would encourage. April 30th at the Hope Center, and you can find out more at Leadership Vistas. And then prayer, I don't want to make that last, but it's the third one on the sheet there. But it's a really important one, because you are, as you just already pointed out, dealing with people with incredible needs who are coming asking for prayer, having faced levels of persecution that most of us in North America can't even imagine.
And that would be my first and foremost prayer request. Having witnessed it firsthand with my first visit in November of 2016, they literally have challenges that we can't fathom, and I couldn't have before that time. Honestly, I've read about it. I could have experienced it through that, but you really don't. And by going and seeing it, they literally face things that we do actually take for granted here. And so, praying for them to be strong, to stand firm, as they are examples to us of that every day, and to be able to continue to do so. I would appreciate everyone praying for those church leaders who do that in Africa. Yes.
Now, somebody would want to know a little bit more. Since you're located in the Hope Center, it seems to me that if somebody wanted to just come and look around, see what's available, or find out more about this dinner that's coming April 30th. Is that a possibility? Of course, you have a way in which people can connect up with you, but talk about how people can get closer to you and learn a little bit more about what you're doing.
Oh, yes. I would welcome the opportunity to meet with anyone who would want to. I'm always available, but also you can just drop by the Hope Center. And we are an open door to anyone who'd want to learn more. And I always enjoy talking about what God is doing, not only with Leadership Vistas, but we're in a smaller area of the Hope Center called the Ruth Center,
right?
That actually has some smaller ministries like ours, but there's a synergy and a togetherness and just a total. It's not a dependence, but it's just different in that regard. And I would love to share with anyone what all of those are doing, as well as the larger ones are throughout the Hope Center as well, because it is very obvious that God is doing a great thing through the Hope Center and through the ministries that are privileged to be there.
One last comment. We have a section there on where we serve, take action, contact us, but also donate. What are some of the financial needs so that people that might want to make this part of their mission budget or give you to you individually? Talk about that if they might.
Well, one thing I've had to learn over the last couple of years is that there is a need for constant fundraising, and it is very evident the Lord wants us doing His mission in Africa, and the reality is for us to accomplish that, we really need folks to give, and that has been a great blessing for me, just to see the hearts open of people who just want to give. And so there's so many ways. One is the traditional way they can go to the website and donate through that with a one-time gift. We really pray for recurring givers, or what we refer to as Vista Legacy Partners, folks who will come alongside us on a monthly, quarterly, semi-annual basis and give and just partner with us in that way. But then we have specific things as well. We have what we started just last year, and Jolynn Brown, who still works with me in the ministry, took this and ran with it, and it's just been great. We call it the PSI, Pastoral Scholarship Initiative.
Perfect. And
someone can sponsor a church leader for $200. And
that's great.
And what we do is send them a picture of that person along with a few details, but not too much, and then the prayer request of that particular church leader, such that that supporter can have that in their home and pray for that person regularly. So,
just before I let you go, let me just talk about the fact that you would be available to come and speak at a missions conference at a church or something like that.
I would love to.
And I think that's another thing, because
anytime.
I would imagine there are a lot of people that say, this is the first time I've ever heard about Leadership Vistas, and maybe our congregation needs to know a little bit more. And I think you could really make the case. I know that sometimes when I've had individuals here from Africa, their English isn't as good, and so your English is very good, and you could make the case for so many, show some pictures, some slides, and really recruit some people to be a part of that as well. So there's a place where you can take action. That's the middle button there. But again, one more time, it's a 5-minute video. Take the time to watch the video, click that share button, and educate some others. If you know a pastor or a missions pastor that doesn't know about Leadership Vistas, take what you just heard and pass it on to them as well. So, Andy, thanks for coming by. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity.
We're going to take a break. We're going to get back into some of the news cycle, and just for a short period of time. And then just a program note, Jerry Tuma will be with us. We're going to be talking about some of the biblical principles about your finances. And one aspect of that is to give to ministries like Leadership Vistas. So we'll be talking with him in just about a half an hour. All that coming up right after this.
It wasn't long ago, it seemed, every official decision brought religious liberty and our ability to live as faithful Christians into question. Some of us wondered how long it would be before we were literally forced to choose between obeying God or men. That pressure seems to have subsided just a bit, and now is the time not to take a breath, but to work as hard as we can for the future of our nation. Thanks to you, Point of View is doing just that. And our special thanks to those who have become members of Truth Team 360. In football, 22 guys battle it out on the field while 40 or 60,000 watch in the stands, and perhaps hundreds of thousands more watch on television. We need a special few to get out of the seats and into the game. Join today by calling 1-800-347-5151 and ask to join the Truth Team, or visit us online at pointofview.net/team. We really do need you. The nation needs you. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again. Of course, we had Andy Bunn in with us for a few minutes as we talked about Leadership Vistas, what's happening in Africa. And before I move into a lot of stories here in the United States, I thought we would keep our attention on Africa for just a minute. And that is, if nothing else, to first of all highlight and to focus some of our attention, especially our prayers, about the genocide that is taking place in Nigeria, point number one. Point number two, to just shake our heads at the fact that the mainstream media is not even talking about that. And if you wanted to have a subset under that, I saw some posts recently saying, why isn't President Trump talking about that? Okay, so that could be a second point under that, or even a third point. I'll leave that to you. But John Stonestreet, he gets high marks for the fact that yesterday his piece was on Christians Die, Media Mum. And he pointed out that the individual who is one of the Colson Center Fellows, Dr. Glenn Sunshine, who, by the way, I know when I spoke in his church in Connecticut, which was the church that Jonathan Edwards actually attended when he was at Yale, and I got to preach from the pulpit, interestingly enough, in that rickety old pulpit area, which was not the one Jonathan Edwards has done. The church in Connecticut has been there so long, it was burned down 2 different times by the Indians. Of course, that's back in the 18th century, but it's been there a long time. But nevertheless, Glenn Sunshine is kind of really an expert. We've had on the program before. Maybe he's due for a return. But nevertheless, he's been using his Facebook page and other venues that he has to alert people about what the mainstream media is ignoring. And that is, as he said, and this is now John Stonestreet, last summer on Breakpoint, I talked about the violence targeting Christians in what's known as the middle belt of Nigeria. The population of Nigeria is almost evenly divided between Muslims and Christians, but the northern part is pretty much Muslim. The southern part is heavily Christian. I have, for example, a person in my Sunday school class who's gotten his doctorate from Dallas Theological Seminary and is going back to Nigeria. He was here for a while getting surgery and some things of that nature, but will be going back and, of course, building a seminary. Unfortunately, those are both accurate statements in that area of Nigeria. But as you might imagine, of course, the middle belt is where all of this is taking place, where there are enough Muslims to cause a problem. And so Open Doors, who we've had on the program many times before, has referred to this as a religious cleansing. And you're pretty much familiar with what has happened. First of all, you have Boko Haram, which we've talked about before, which has been responsible not only for killing thousands of Christians, but also has been the group that abducted all of those young girls, some of which have escaped, most we have never heard from again. And then now you've had another situation in which you have the Fulani herdsmen, which are oftentimes just simply presented as an ethnic group. But again, they're overwhelmingly Muslim, and they have raids. Of course, most of the time the raids are at night, but not always. And so again, the Nigerian Christian leaders have talked about the continuous abduction of underage Christian girls by the Muslim youth, that the girls are forcibly converted to Islam, taken in marriage without the consent of their parents. And, of course, you've had this issue of religious cleansing. Something I might get into again in the future, but I just thought since we were talking about Africa at the moment, these are issues we should be praying about and know more about. And shame on the secular press. If, a Muslim is attacked, and, of course, there has been all sorts of reasons to be concerned about the attack on Muslims because of what happened in New Zealand, then we hear all about that. But if Jews are attacked, sometimes we hear about that if it's a horrific kind of action. But as you've heard me mention even yesterday, if you look at even the hate crimes in America, a majority of them now, according to the FBI, so we'll just assume the FBI statistics are accurate, and then you are dealing with the fact that there are all sorts of attacks against Jewish synagogues, Jewish individuals, Jewish religious centers. And, of course, those don't get as much attention. And, of course, when you go overseas, the anti-Semitism is even worse. but the attack on Christians in almost all of these Muslim countries is something which we appreciate groups like Open Doors or Breakpoint or others identifying these issues, but they are certainly not being covered by the mainstream press. So, end of my brief announcement, which we may come back to a little bit more in the future. But I thought I would also pick up, since we are talking about this attack in New Zealand. You heard me mention a little bit yesterday with Chelsea and some of the conversation we had about anti-Semitism, and I spent even more time the other day talking about how when indeed you had some of these anti-Semitic comments by Ilhan Omar, then you had Chelsea Clinton, to her credit, actually come forward and say, we actually reject these anti-Semitic ideas. Well, Ben Shapiro has written a piece which I sort of have already been kind of mentioning, and he titles it How to Silence Debate, New Zealand Edition. And that is, we're starting to find out that the Muslim apologists are starting to figure out that one of the ways to stifle any conversation, any critique of Islam, is to say that even if you speak out against anti-Semitism, that are some of the anti-Semitic comments by Muslims, that is feeding Islamophobia. And as I shared just the other day, Chelsea Clinton was confronted by a number of individuals who are students at New York, basically saying that the result of the massacre was stoked by people like you, the words you put out in the world. 49 people died because of the rhetoric you put out there. And to his credit, Donald Trump Jr. supported her, and a few others have, including the mayor of New York. But apart from that, there has been almost silence from any other Democrat leader or even people in the press. And the point that Ben Shapiro is making is a good one, because, as he says, mainstream commentators attempted to use the New Zealand anti-Muslim terror attack to blame critics of radical Islam. Omar Aziz, writing for the New York Times, slammed Jordan Peterson for Islamophobia, a word created by fascists, and also slammed Sam Harris for calling it intellectual blood libel. Now, first of all, recognize that we're talking about Jordan Peterson. Probably fair to call him a secular Jew. Sam Harris is an atheist. He's one of the so-called new atheists. So it isn't just that they're attacking, people of faith. It isn't just they're even attacking people that have some kind of political stature, like Chelsea Clinton, but they're attacking people that are maybe Jewish, like Ben Shapiro, who are Orthodox Jew, or people that are secular Jews, like Jordan Peterson, or individuals that aren't anything and are atheists and part of the new atheists, like Sam Harris. As a matter of fact, he goes on to say that Bill Maher, another atheist, has come in for similar criticism. Of course, he says, so as I have already sort of alluded to that as well, in which, if nothing else, Ben Shapiro was criticized for, in one case, reading off poll statistics from various Muslim countries on a variety of topics, including this very high percentage of Muslims who believed radical things. By the way, if you find yourself saying, I've never seen that poll, my book on Islam and terrorism provides much of that, but of course you can simply do a Google search and find that as well. And Ben Shapiro kind of ends his piece by saying this: here's the truth. Radical Islam is dangerous. The Islamic world has a serious problem with radical Islam, and large swaths of the Muslim world are in fact hostile to Western values on matters ranging from freedom of speech to women's rights. To conflate that obvious truth with the desire to murder innocents in New Zealand is intellectual dishonesty of its highest sort. If we want more Muslims living in liberty and freedom, we must certainly demolish white supremacism, and we must also demolish radical Islam, devotees of which were responsible for an estimated 84,000 deaths in 2017 alone. Most of the victims, by the way, are Muslim. The greatest threat to a Muslim in the world today? Another Muslim. And here's the other truth. Anti-Semitism is ugly, whether it's coming from white supremacists or Ilhan Omar, who is a member of Congress, making that point has nothing to do with the killing of Muslims in New Zealand. So long as the media continue to push the narrative that criticism of Islam is tantamount to incitement of murder, radical Islam will continue to flourish. So long as the media continue to cover for the dishonest argument that criticism of anti-Semitism forwards the goals of white supremacists, anti-Semitism will continue to flourish. Honest discussion about hard issues isn't incitement. 3 cheers for Ben Shapiro, and I just thought I would mention that issue that I think illustrates the point. The killing of all the Muslims in New Zealand has been used as a weapon against even an honest conversation about Islam. Let's take a break. We've got a lot more to cover, and we will do so right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Confirmation hearings have been interesting of late. Some senators are asking questions of nominees that are more than tough, they're unfair. My favorite example of this came when Senator Cory Booker asked judicial nominee Naomi Rao whether she believed homosexuality is a sin. Now, that's a question that seems out of line because it invites the nominee to assert a theological pronouncement. Senator Mike Lee thought so too. He said, "I can't fathom a circumstance in which it's ever appropriate for us to ask a nominee about his or her religious beliefs about whether X, Y, or Z is a sin." Senator Lee then had to remind Senator Mazie Hirono of Senator Booker's actual question about sin when Senator Hirono shot back, "It's not that we all ask, do you think such and such is a sin, etc., etc." These questions may in fact violate Article 6 of the Constitution, which guarantees that no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. Forcing citizens to adhere to a specific religious ideology, or none at all, violates the rights common to our humanity, rights endowed to us by our Creator. Article 6 exists to keep the halls of government open to an ideological variety of Americans. That's something our senators would do well to remember. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. Let me ask you, what if America's best attorneys from the very top law firms got together to defend religious freedom in court? That's exactly what's happening at First Liberty. And the best news? We're winning over 90% of our legal actions. Come learn more at firstliberty.org. You'll be encouraged. That's firstliberty.org.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more
This is
minutes.
Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. My story of Point of View really goes back to when I was in law school. I would listen to this show, and I was just blown away that there was actually a show that would analyze what was going on in our current world through a Christian worldview. It was something that stoked a fire in me early that turned out what I would be doing with my career for the Lord. So that's my story with Point of View, and I'd like to hear yours.
To share your story with Kelly and Kerby, you can call us at 800-347-5151, or you can do it online at pointofview.net/share-your-story. If we share your story with the Point of View audience, we'll send you a Bible stick as our thank you. That number to call is 800-347-5151 or online at pointofview.net/share your story.
Again, we'd love to hear your story. We had a chance to hear Kelly Shackelford's, and there's an opportunity for you to share your story on the website, pointofview.net. Just click on the button that says Share Here. Or many of you perhaps have already received an email from me in which we've given you a link. So if you would like to verbalize your story, which we would love to have, you can certainly call that number, 800-347-5151. Or, of course, the other way you can possibly do that is just write it out. We can maybe call you later or voice it for you. So, again, all available at the website, pointofview.net. Jerry Tuma will be with me in just a few minutes in studio, but I thought I'd pick out just 2 or 3 other stories we've been following just to give you a little bit more closure. One of the concerns I've had over these years is sometimes a story gets one-day exposure, whether it's in the national media, even your local media, and nobody comes back and says, well, what's the next step? This one is not necessarily next step, but it's another way to look at the cheating scandal, the college admission scandal, or the college cheating scandal. Walter Williams, who's been on the program with us, been quite a while, but when he has, writes, of course, a column, and this one appeared in Town Hall, in which he said, federal prosecutors have charged more than 50 people involved in cheating and bribery in order to get their kids admitted to some of the nation's most prestigious colleges and universities, such as Georgetown, Yale, Stanford, University of Texas, University of Southern California, UCLA. They often paid more than $100,000 to rig SAT or ACT exams. In some instances, they bribed college officials and secured their children's admissions to elite schools through various fraud schemes. As corrupt and depraved as these recent revelations are, Walter Williams says, they are only the tip of the iceberg of generalized college corruption and gross dishonesty. And this is why I wanted to read this for just another minute or two, because he has illustrated what I've said before. Matter of fact, the other day we were even walking, and my wife was saying, I don't know why they're making such a big deal about this. I think what they did was wrong, but this isn't the first time. And she used all sorts of examples. If your last name is Kennedy, you're going to get into some of these schools. And I said, yeah, of course, if you are a legacy, and I've used that even in my own experience at an Ivy League school, you can see that, hey, if my grandfather went to that school, in this case Yale, my father went to Yale, I get to go to Yale. And so anyway, I've seen that. Okay, we understand that. But this is a bigger issue. And so let me come back to Dr. Walter Williams for just a minute. He says, first of all, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, 70% of white high school graduates in 2016 enrolled in college, and 58% of black high school graduates enrolled in college. However, that year only 37% of white high school graduates tested as college ready, but college admitted 70% of them. And I wrote a commentary about that a while back if you want to dig it up, in terms of the disparity between those who are college ready and the number that were actually brought into college. And if you think it's bad for the white high school graduates, here's the numbers for black high school graduates. Roughly 17% of those high school graduates tested as college ready, but colleges admitted 58% of them. It's always helpful to mention that Dr. Walter Williams is African American, so if a white person said that, it might be seen as racist. I can let him say it because it actually is true and should be said no matter what your skin color might be. He goes on to say that about 40% of college freshmen must take at least one remedial course. To deal with ill-prepared students, professors dumb down their courses so that students can get passing grades. Colleges also set up majors with little or no academic content so to accommodate students with limited academic abilities. Such majors often include the terms studies, ethnic studies, cultural studies, gender studies, or American studies. The major selected by the most ill-prepared students, sadly enough, is education. When students' SAT scores are ranked by intended major, education majors place 26th on a list of 38. He says one gross example of academic and administrative dishonesty surfaced in the University of North Carolina. A learning specialist hired to help UNC athletes found that 60% of the 183 members of the football and basketball teams read between the 4th and 8th grade reading levels. About 10% read below 3rd grade level. And these athletes both graduated from high school and were admitted to UNC. More likely, UNC is not alone in those practices because sports are the money-making center of many universities. He says it's nearly impossible to listen to college presidents, provosts, and other administrators talk for more than 15 minutes or so before the words diversity and inclusion drop from their lips. But there's a simple way to determine just how committed they are to their rhetoric. Ask your average college president, provost, or administrator whether he bothers promoting political diversity among faculty. I'll guarantee that if he's honest and even answers the question, he will say he doesn't believe in that kind of diversity and inclusion. According to a recent study, professors who are registered Democrats outnumber their Republican counterpoints by 12-to-1 ratio. In some departments, such as history, Democratic-related and registered professors outrank their Republican counterparts by a ratio of 33-to-1. The fact is that when college presidents and their group talk about diversity and inclusion, they're talking mostly about pleasing mixtures of race and sex. Years ago, their agenda was called affirmative action, racial preferences, or racial quotas. These terms fell out of favor in usage as voters approved initiatives banning choosing by race, and courts found solely based admissions unconstitutional. So people had to repackage their race-based agenda and call it diversity and inclusion. Some were bold enough to argue that diversity produces educational benefits to all students, including white students. Nobody has bothered to scientifically establish just what those benefits are. For example, does a racially diverse undergraduate student body lead to higher scores on graduate admissions, such as the GRE or the LSAT or MCAT? By the way, Israel, Japan, and South Korea are among the world's least racially diverse nations. In terms of academic achievement, their students run circles around diversity-crazed Americans. I'm not sure what can be done about education, but the first step towards any solution is for the American people to be aware of academic fraud that occurs at every level of education. You know, we might want to vilify the 50 individuals caught in this latest scandal, college admission scandal, but Walter Williams reminds us there's just a whole lot more going on, and so we're going to spend some time probably in the future getting into that, and I believe that this is not the last time we're going to hear about a college admission scandal. I think there are other shoes to drop very, very soon. When we come back from the break, though, we're going to spend some time applying biblical principles and just very sound economic principles to what's happening in the economy. If you've always heard the word stagflation, you wonder, what exactly is that? What about the federal debt, something I have written about recently? What about Medicare and Social Security and some of that? Going to spend some time working on that, and Jerry Tuma will be in the studio with us. But again, if you'd like to find some of the material we've already covered on the program, or you'd like to read some of the other articles we'll be referencing, it's all available at the website, pointofview.net. Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover, and we will do so right after this.
The leader looked around the table, motioning to the older men. He said, "You're here to remind us how faithful God has been in the past. Now, you middle-aged guys, you keep us focused on what God is doing right now. Make sure we don't stop. And you younger guys, keep us looking forward. Imagine what God wants us to be doing in the years to come." There's a lot of wisdom there. We have to be thankful for the past, focused on the present, and mindful to plan for a great future. Many listeners have made bold moves to partner with Point of View Radio and accomplish great things for more than 45 years. But as we look around, we do see many positive things, and I think we can all admit there's a lot more to be done. It's time to think about your next bold move, what you can do to invest for our nation's future. Be thinking about that. If you have an answer now, don't wait. Make your next bold move now. Give online at pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151. It's our future. The time is now. Pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. We're going to be talking about what's happening in the economy and your finances. And to really put this in perspective, if you've been listening even the last couple of days, we've been talking about this growing wish list that is coming from various individuals who are running for the Democratic nomination to the presidency. And if you have paid any attention and made your list like I have, it's Medicare for all, which is kind of single payer. It's the Green New Deal. It's abortion until birth. They're even talking about birthday abortions. Weird concept. Free college tuition. One we're going to come back to in a minute. This idea of a guaranteed basic income. Of course, a living wage of $15 an hour. Abolishing ICE. Eliminating private health insurance. Government daycare. Reparations. Even lowering the voter age to 16. Getting rid of the electoral college. That's the short list. And that has some implications. Now, the bottom line is, will those individuals that are running either for the presidency or for Congress enact some of this? Some they will, some they won't. But it's going to have an impact anyway. And that if that's not enough, even no matter who the president is, who the member of Congress is, there are some warning signs in the future here. So we're going to talk about some of the so-called entitlement programs. What about the issue of Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security, the debt rate, and all the rest? And it was something I was thinking we should cover sometime soon, because I was just writing some articles about that. And lo and behold, I get this PowerPoint presentation from Jerry Tuma, and that's what he wants to talk about. I said, this is perfect. So first of all, let me just mention, Jerry Tuma, of course, is with us. He is the founder and president of Cornerstone Financial Services, which is a state-registered investment advisory firm here in the Dallas area. But again, material on this program is intended for general information only, should not be taken as specific investment, tax, or legal advice. Just a disclaimer we add, because we want you to understand that as you're thinking about what you want to do with your finances, you may want to talk to him off air, but we can talk about some of the general issues. And I don't think you and I, Jerry, are old enough to say we've been through many presidential elections. Mm-hmm. I have never seen one party sort of try to outleft itself in ways that are sort of unfolding before our very eyes. But whether one of those individuals becomes the next president or they dominate both the House and the Senate, there are some really important issues we're going to talk about this next hour that affect people's finances, right?
Absolutely, Kerby. It's just the left, the far left, is becoming more and more unhinged. So they have this new theory called modern monetary theory.
Wow.
And I won't go into the details on it because it's gibberish, economic gibberish for most people. But bottom line is guarantee everybody at least $15 an hour. If the private sector, the economy, if they're not hiring, then the government should hire everybody to guarantee everyone has a job.
Everybody has a job.
And everybody gets $15 an hour plus benefits. And, oh, by the way, what if they don't want to work? Well, that's just too bad. Then it's a guarantee for everything. Oh, and the deficit, which has gone from, if you think back about the national debt, and this, to me, Kerby, best way to envision this, of course, my wife had a long battle with cancer in the 90s, so I'm a little bit familiar with that. And she had to she's over it now. She's over the cancer. But bottom line is this. It's sort of like having a tumor that all of a sudden just keeps growing. And at first, you don't notice it. At first, it's not affecting the health of the patient. But if it reaches a point of critical mass where it sort of starts taking over the systems of the body, then that's when it produces death. And the Bible says there's a way that seemeth right unto a man, but the end thereof is death.
Yes.
And debt, if you go back to the root word of the scripture in the Hebrew is the bite of the serpent. That's what usury or interest is all about. So the bottom line is the left is becoming more and more unhinged. I mean, completely unhinged on all these things that they're trying to pass. The problem is there's a receptive audience in some sectors of our society because typically, again, minorities tend to align over there, but also the millennials that have been taught that socialism is the greatest thing that's ever occurred in the history of man, in spite of the fact it's never worked in history anywhere it's been tried. Excuse me, Mr. Left professor, rather. So the issue is we've got a runaway entitlement freight train with what's already been baked in the system before we pass any of this other stuff. Oh, and by the way, the left says, well, don't worry about if we run deficits or debt. You know, the government debt, just to give you some history, folks, and this is something I guess we may make some of these charts available on our website with Kerby's help. But the national debt of the U.S. government, essentially, let's say from the Revolutionary War, started with a small amount of debt, George Washington, to George W. Bush. It reached $7 trillion over, umpteen zillion wars, World War I, World War II, Revolutionary War, Korea, you name it. And since 2008, it's gone to $22 trillion. From $7 trillion to $22 trillion. So it takes us, 200 plus years to get to $7 trillion, and it takes us a little over 10 years to triple that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Kerby, that's with only 2/3 of the baby boomers not having qualified for Medicare yet, which is the 800-pound gorilla of government entitlements.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, it's really more like King Kong. It's not really the 800-pound gorilla. If you remember the old King Kong movies,
it's even bigger.
The King Kong is up there swatting planes off the top of the Empire State Building. Medicare is a monster entitlement, and we barely even started. A third of the baby boomers are even qualified for that yet. What happens over the next decade when all of the baby boomers, 76 million, the largest generation in history thus far, until the millennials came along, are being paid Social Security and Medicare? You have all these entitlement programs. The national debt is going to it's literally like a runaway freight train going straight down a mountain at 100 miles an hour with no brakes. As a matter of fact, that's why the main thing Paul Ryan, when he retired as House, Speaker of the House, he said, my main regret is we couldn't tackle the entitlement problem.
Yeah.
No matter what we tried. So now, by the way, Kerby, we don't want to look at this under negative auspices. It's easy to get gloomy and doomy. I know every time I speak in front of a group and I bring all these numbers up, the countenance of the room kind of drops. And they're like, oh, no, yeah, because eventually this is going to be a problem, and it is going to be a big problem. We have to, again, look at it through opportunity lenses. At the same time, we cannot let the left just run rampant. Okay, get out the credit cards and, the national debt at $22 trillion now, it might be $50 trillion in a decade. It might be $50 trillion in 5 years, the way they're running it. So what we've got to do on the one hand is win the political wars as much as we can. At the same time, I think it's instructive that Alan Greenspan in his elder years, he's 92 now, I think. He doesn't have a president to answer to or Senate. He's running around the country saying that the next decade will be like the 1970s, a period of stagflation or much higher inflation in the next decade. And I see that as the only alternative, because if you look at the history of what we're talking about here, where the government piles up debt off the top of debt on top of debt on top of debt, eventually they have to run the printing presses day and night and day to pay for all that. That means much higher inflation down the road. To me, that's close as you can get to a guarantee on anything right now. I see no other way except to print your way out of this deal. And if you look at the history of recorded monetary history throughout history, all the way back, forget the lunacy left, because they don't ever look at history. They don't look at anything that's real world. They only believe in their socialist fantasies. Bottom line is, every time you've ever had a runaway situation with debt, you can't tax people enough. You print money. It destroys the currency over time. And I know we're running up to the break here, so I'll be quiet. But the bottom line is, that's the way it looks like it's headed to me.
We're going to take a break, but when we come back, we mentioned the word stagflation. Maybe you've heard that before. What does that mean? Of course, there's some PowerPoint slides that go to this, and we'll talk about how you can get that at Cornerstone Report and Cornerstone Financial. But and again, if you think we're being partisan, let's just face it, whether the economy is run by a Republican president or a Democratic president, a Republican Congress or a Democratic Congress, the national debt keeps going up. We'll come back and talk more about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
We're a divided country, but it may be worse than we imagined. An article in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences discussed what is called motive attribution asymmetry. That's a technical term for the assumption that your ideology is based in love and your opponent's is based on hate. Put another way, we're the good guys, they're the bad guys. They discovered that the average Republican and the average Democrat today are as divided as the Palestinians and Israelis. In his op-ed in the New York Times, Arthur Brooks says we see the other side as an enemy with whom one cannot negotiate or compromise. He comes to this startling conclusion. People often say that our problem in America is incivility or intolerance. He says that's incorrect. Motive attribution asymmetry leads to something far worse, contempt, which is a noxious brew of anger and disgust. And it is made worse by what he calls the outrage industrial complex that oftentimes caters to one side and criticizes the other. Now, when people hear about political conflicts, they often prescribe the wrong solutions. Just because we disagree doesn't mean we should put aside our disagreements. Arthur Brooks instead says that we need not disagree less. Instead, we need to disagree better. Whether we're discussing politics, economics, or philosophy, we should engage in a robust competition of ideas. We can disagree without being so disagreeable. So he suggests 2 steps. First, turn away from what he calls the rhetorical dope peddlers. These are powerful people on your side who are profiting from the culture of contempt. Second, make a commitment never to treat others with contempt. Christians should be civil and gracious. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Jerry Tuma in studio today, and I know many of you are going to want to ask some questions, so we'll certainly give you that opportunity. 1-800-351-1212. President and founder of Cornerstone Financial Services, and we have a link to cornerstonereport.com, and we both have in front of us here your PowerPoint presentation. I've suggested that maybe you could make available to some of the people at the Cornerstone Report these slides. There are about 24 of them, and we'll be explaining that, but sometimes people like to see it for themselves. You know, the Social Security Trust Fund, what's happening there, the Medicare expenditures and all the rest. But let me come back to this point for just a minute, because some people see this as partisan. And yes, we went from $7 trillion in debt to now $22 trillion, and 8 of those years were under Obama. Now 2 of those years almost under Trump. This, again, has nothing to do with being Republican or Democrat. I wish it did. I mean, I wish I could say that there was really no difference between what happened under Bill Clinton and Barack Obama compared to what happened under George Herbert Walker Bush and George W. Bush. But the reality is that the national debt keeps going up, and there are some reasons for it. And here's the other issue, if I can make the other point that I mentioned in one of my articles. When George W. Bush was talking about the tax cut, there were some people saying, what would this do to the deficit? And supposedly at the time, Vice President Cheney said, deficits don't matter. Okay, fast forward to the Obama administration. I, in one of my articles, pointed out that when President Obama was spending and spending and spending and spending, and people were asking about deficits, you had Paul Krugman, who is a Nobel Prize-winning economist at the New York Times, saying, no, actually deficits are good because we can borrow at a very low interest and use this to build the infrastructure. Well, first of all, the interest rates are 3 times, almost 4 times higher than they were just a few years ago.
Right.
Number 2, The money's not going to build roads and bridges. It's going to fund these entitlement programs we're talking about. So here's something that nobody will tell you. When my guy's in power, deficits don't matter. When the guy I don't like's in power, deficits are a catastrophe. You know, what we're here to say is they're a problem. And a lot of people, Jerry, are going to be saying, why aren't I hearing about this in the mainstream press? And this is why we cover this stuff on Point of View. I'm just appalled. Just a couple of years ago, I found one of my commentaries was I predicting that we might reach $20 trillion by 2020.
Oh, yeah.
We reached that a couple of years ago.
Yes, we did.
I mean, even the predictions people were making were off. We're at $22 trillion before we even have a presidential campaign. And you see how many presidential nominees or how many individuals running for Congress even talk about the deficit. That's why we're talking about it, because it relates back to this issue. Let's define the word stagflation. People hear that all the time, okay, and you're making this prediction that that's going to be a big issue, and that affects our finances,
and
doesn't
that's what I've felt for all time, is that this eventually will be resolved through a hyperinflationary type deal. So
yeah.
Greenspan, again, is going around the country, and I didn't copy him, and he didn't copy me, obviously, but telling everybody, he seems to be on a crusade to let people know the next decade is going to be radically different than what we've been through in modern history. He said, we have not had a decade like this since the 1970s. So let me define stagflation, if you will.
Yeah.
Stagflation means that you have slower economic growth. You still have economic growth. That doesn't mean you can't have recessions, because you'll still have recessions periodically. Business cycle's not revoked. But with accelerating inflation. In the old days, they thought you can't have recession and inflation at the same time. And then 74 came along, 1974, they figured out, oops, no, you can. You can have inflation accelerating at the same time the economy's soft. So he's talking about stagflation, and that really, again, affects radically what kind of investment advisory type things people should do.
I would say so.
I got in this business in 1980. I was green as I could be, 25, 24 years old, I think, when I got my licenses. And we were coming out of the 1970s decade at that time. And I remember that one of the ladies came in my office, just started on a Christian radio. What an expert I was at age 24, don't you know? And she sat across the desk from me. She said, Jerry, what should I do? I said, I don't know what's your situation. She said, well, I bought an 8% yielding treasury bond, 30-year treasury bond 2 years ago. And today it's worth 54 cents on the dollar if I were to sell it. The bond market just got blistered. It got burned up. Think of taking an old-fashioned bond like they used to have, the coupons, you clip them, and take your lighter and just crisp them.
Burn them.
Because bonds are not going to be something that works in inflation. And it's too long an explanation to get into with the amount of time we've got. But bottom line is we're going into a decade that we haven't experienced in, 50 years now? And so the issue is most people are not prepared for that. Now, how does it affect real estate? It's positive for real estate. It's positive for oil. It's positive for gold. It's a little bit tough for stocks, but the bottom line is we've kind of got to prepare for what's coming. You got to look forward. The old saying about past performance is no guarantee kind of thing is true. The asset allocation models that you have that 99.99% of the advisors out there are using, they really sort of ignore the information prior to 1980. Oops. Mm-hmm. What about if we do go into 70s style inflation that's coming? And really even the bigger threat to me is beyond that, and that is that we have runaway inflation.
Right.
Hyper-type inflation.
Where the dollars in your purse or your pocket or your wallet are less tomorrow than they are today.
And that's exactly. That's radical hyperinflation. Yes. There are a number of examples
where
of that
you're running
history.
to the bank or you're running to the grocery store because by the end of the day, the dollars are worth a whole lot less.
And what happens, Kirby, is exactly what the left and their unhinged modern monetary theory, what they say that we should do is just, it doesn't matter how big the deficits are, just have the Federal Reserve print money and pay for it all, and it's a free lunch. Yeah. I'm like, a free lunch? You really believe there's a free lunch? There is such thing as a free lunch. Not exactly, but people want to believe that. And if they're not educated on this topic, they will believe everything the Democrats are throwing out there, the far left. And the far left's getting further left. And the issue is, this Republican administration, Trump hasn't really tried to tackle entitlements. He's doing everything he can to fix everything else. But they ran $1 trillion deficit. Think of it this way. These numbers are approximate, but they're pretty close. So the government spending for the previous year was $3.5 trillion. The income they brought in terms of taxes was $2.5 trillion.
Right.
That's like a person that makes $100,000 a year as a couple spending $150,000 a year every year.
Or the other example I love to use, just change the zeros and just imagine if you're spending $32,000 a year,
right,
but you're only bringing in $25,000 a year. And,
Absolutely.
And again, a lot of people say, well, you're just talking about the left. No, I'm talking about 3 years ago when it looked like Donald Trump was going to be the nominee, and we were pretty sure that Hillary Clinton was. Neither Hillary Clinton nor Donald Trump were talking about these issues. Right. And there's no reason to believe that Donald Trump is going to change in the next year. Mm-mm. And there is even less reason to believe the Democratic nominee, whoever he or she will be, will actually address this either. So we're sort of like a train where there isn't any engineer that could hit the brakes, right?
Good way to put it.
And so we're on the passenger side, and the question is, what are you going to do about it? And again, a lot of people say, well, why do you say inflation? Well, Social Security. You have more and more people that are going to be receiving Social Security, more and more people that are going to be receiving Medicare. We saw that coming a long time ago,
right?
But we didn't put money in a Social Security trust fund. We borrowed from it,
right?
And so as a result, to pay all the people, if you're over the age of 65, to pay you, or if you're less than 65, to pay you in the future, if there's no money in there, how do you do it? Well, you print more money. Well, the more money you print, the less the dollars in your pocket actually work. So it's not real complicated, but when nobody's talking about it, except maybe Jerry Tuma and you and me and a handful of other people, there have been some members of Congress, this changes the way in which people have to think about where they're going to put their investments, doesn't it?
It does. Where they should put their investments and how we need to go through the next 10, 15 years, however long it is. You know, my wife briefly did a thing with, I don't know if you know Andrea Lafferty. She's been up there years trying to campaign against everything the left's trying to do for Christian purposes. They went up and looked at one part of the government, National Institutes of Health, and they did about a 3-week research on this, pulled up stuff off the Institutes of Health's website, and my wife made a sneak attack. She kind of did a sting with Kay Bailey Hutchison's office, and no offense to Kay Bailey, but she got up there and just told him, I am not leaving until I talk to someone important here. And finally, she got to see the chief of staff.
Yeah.
And she went in there to the conference room with the guy, and she said, I'm here to talk to you about the National Institutes of Health spending. And he said, ma'am, we're not going to cut your benefits. First thing out of his mouth.
Yeah.
She flipped open this notebook that was 6 inches loaded with their stuff, and it was a bunch of guys that were being paid. They were dressed in drag, a bunch of professors out having a party, getting some big grant from the government. And she said he nearly fell over backward in his chair. When she opened it, he flipped back in his chair like he'd slapped him. And he said, that's not the National Institutes of Health. She said, it's off your website.
Yes.
Here's a $750,000 grant for how prostitutes spread venereal disease at truck stops. Let's study that. The waste and corruption in government has just gotten beyond anything we've ever seen in our lifetimes. The issue is that the debt's coming due, and that's going to look very different in the next decade than what it's looked like in the last decade.
Well, let's come back and first of all, open up the phones, 1-800-351-1212, but also come back and see if we can say, okay, if stagflation's on the future, what do we do with the resources God's placed in our hands? We'll be right back.
Point of View Radio has been changing lives for a generation. Listeners have been inspired to apply themselves in all kinds of ways, to stand up as lawyers defending the Constitution and freedom, to start Christian schools, training up a new generation, to launch ministries on college campuses, even to run for and serve in Congress. So again, what are you doing to make a positive change? One way to start today is to join the Truth Team, Truth Team 360, and help us change lives. Our nation needs a Truth Team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. One of the questions I want to put on the table is, do you think we have a problem with debt in the federal government? I believe that we do. By the way, I think we have a problem with debt at the federal level. Many states have a problem with debt, not necessarily because most states have to balance the budget, but they have a problem with their pension programs and things of that nature. Do we have a problem with debt in terms of personal debt? And that is certainly the case. If you look at mortgage debt, which is the top one, at least there you have an asset. And then you move down to the next one, which would be student loan debt, which is, again, the next one on the list. Then you move down to credit card debt and auto loan debt. At least with a car or a house, you have some collateral. But what do you have when you spend money on a credit card and go out to eat, or a student loan debt? But those are just a personal indebtedness. So I'd love to hear your comments about the fact that we seem to be in debt as a country, but then also the issue of spending. And so, Jerry, I want to come back to you for just a minute, because one of your slides, which, again, you're going to make available to listeners if they'd like to see it for themselves, are the number of people that receive right now Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, food stamps. Give us a little bit of a rundown.
Well, Medicaid, now these numbers are a couple of years old, but they're directly from the Social Security Administration. 73 million people getting Medicaid, which basically is government-paid, health care. Medicare, which is for over 65. So Medicaid is for people that don't have a lot of money, low income. Medicare is for people over age 65, 68 million. So that's 130 million people right there.
Wow.
Getting some form. And again, out of a population of about 325 million as a nation, 130 million, that's close to 40% of the whole population. 57 million on Social Security. Food stamps, about 44 million. We don't even have federal disability on here. Last time I checked, that ramped up under Obama. That was about 70 million. You've got all these mandatory government programs. A mandatory program means it may not be cut under any conditions. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, supplemental nutritional assistance program for children, unemployment, supplemental security, earned income tax credits, family support, child nutrition, foster care, on and on and on and on. Milton Friedman made the statement, he, in my opinion, is the most important economist of the last 100 years. No such thing as a temporary government program.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like Bill Cosby. I know he's fallen on some hard times, but he had this routine joke that he had back in the 60s, 70s, I guess. The chicken heart that ate up New York City, this big glob that just keeps getting bigger and bigger. And that's what this thing's like.
Yeah.
Government just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, more and more spending. Medicare by itself is expected, right now has made benefit promises. Now, this is money that has not been paid yet.
Right.
Benefit promises.
These are promises.
Another $37 trillion of unfunded liability. So I use the example of King Kong, like the swatting the planes. Think of King Kong, and he's in the circus. He's taking the lions and pitching them around. Medicare is by far the largest obligation of the federal government, and there's no money set aside for this. We're just going to, how are we going to pay for it? Well, we're just going to increase the debt. Well, what if we keep increasing the debt? So we go from 22 trillion to 50 trillion. What if we go to 100 trillion? There is a point of no return, Kerby, where you hit the fiscal wall.
Right.
Now, it's debatable where that wall is exactly, but the studies have shown that once a country gets over 90% debt to GDP ratio, I mean, their economy,
past that now.
The debt, right?
Yeah.
The debt is equal to at least 90% of the value of the produced goods and services every year, which is the GDP, then it starts to weigh on the economic growth. About a percent you'd lose.
Mm-hmm.
The issue, though, is, again, it's like hitting critical mass with a cancer. If you get to the point where cancer gets out of control, you can live with a tumor for decades sometimes, as long as it's contained. The body tries to incorporate protein around it and hold it off. It puts the bad guys in the jail and locks the cell. But if it runs out of control, then it kills somebody when it reaches critical mass. And that's what we're looking at here over the next decade. According to Moody's, which, of course, is a rating agency on Wall Street, the acceleration of interest expense makes debt less affordable and, at worst, unaffordable in the future. Right now, and basically this study was done in 2018, the federal government devotes 8.1% of the revenues that they're getting to service the debts. So they're paying 8% of what we bring in, what we pay in taxes to service the debt of the government, which is $22 trillion, but that's with historically low interest rates. But according to them, by 2027 is not that far away, another 8 years, 21.4% of all government revenues will be needed just to pay the interest.
Just the interest.
Interest only on the debt. We're not talking about retiring any principal on the debt. We're talking about the interest on the debt. There, somewhere between here and 2030, there's a fiscal wall. I don't know where that is exactly, but there's a point in time where, and the problem is we cannot finance all this internally. China owns a lot of our debt. Foreigners own a lot of our debt. Last time I checked, it was about 50% of our debt owned by foreigners.
I just did a commentary just the other day on that.
And they, at some point, decide, we don't like the way your numbers are running, so we don't keep our money here.
Yeah.
And then what do you do?
And again, I want to emphasize, again, some people are going to be hearing this through an ideological prism saying, well, are you anti-Trump or are you anti-Obama, since you talked about the debt going up during President Obama's 8 years? Well, it's gone up also under President Trump's years, and it went under even George W. Bush's. That's not the issue. I mean, no matter who the president is at this point, do we honestly, seriously think Congress will cut any of these entitlement programs? And the answer is no.
And to give you a number,
so how are you going to pay for it? Either you go broke and you stop paying people, or you print money. And the more money you print, the less the dollars in your billfold, your wallet, in your purse, or they decline in value every single day. And we've been down that once.
Just to give you an illustration, when the debt was, this is the last time I had the number calculated, when the debt was $20.6 trillion, which again is now $22 trillion. When it was at $20.6 trillion, that's $63,000, not per taxpayer, but per person. Multiply that times the size of your family, $170,000 per taxpayer. That's for all the debt we've accumulated. So if you run, $10,000, $100,000 a year on credit cards and you do it for 10 years, that's the accumulated debt. That's what we've been doing. This is all the debt we've accumulated since George Washington. But the obligations, if you look further and say, what are the future liabilities of the government? It's $112 trillion, which is $924,000 per taxpayer.
Yeah.
And that number keeps climbing. Go to the U.S. debt clock, and you'll see it climbing every second.
Matter of fact, if you go to the debt clock, I was just looking at it the other day because I was writing my piece on the debt, and it's just clipping. It makes you tense just looking at it. Mm-hmm. But let's take some phone calls, and let me just mention that you don't have it on your website right now, but you'll make that available. There's like 22 slides here, and I know some of these numbers are coming fast and furious, and these graphs just to see what happens in the Social Security Trust Fund, to see Medicare spending, to see the one on the federal debt, as well as Social Security and Medicare cumulative deficits. And then before we're done, I want to get to the population curve, how this is a problem which was made worse by abortion.
You bet.
And we'll talk about that. But let me take some phone calls because some people want to get into some of these conversations. So let's head first to the state of Georgia. Bob, thank you for joining us today.
Hey, how are you today?
Very
I was listening to a national radio show yesterday, Dan Celia, financial advisor, and he's normally upbeat and positive, but yesterday he advised all his listeners to stop buying gold and silver. And the next caller in, he asked about Swiss currency, and he said no. So the guy asked what he should do. He said, I'll tell you and everybody else, buy the most expensive pair of shoes you can buy, because we'll all be standing in the soup line together.
Wow. And we've had Dan on before. We'll probably get him on again. But I know that he's also, as Jerry is and some of these others, and I've sort of noticed this sort of flip. It's not like we haven't known the national debt issue, but there was a couple of other things that are starting to surface, and that is, even going back to the comment by Paul Krugman, who was trying to defend President Barack Obama, he was saying, well, when the interest rates are low, this would be a good time to borrow, because they were like less than 1%, to build infrastructure. Well, if you were borrowing to upgrade your house and then eventually sell your house, that's fine. But first of all, those were low interest rates, but the money didn't go there. It went to current consumption. It would be like borrowing so that I can take my family out to eat, and there's no benefit there. But even if you believe Paul Krugman, and who am I to disagree with a person that won a Nobel Prize in economics, although I disagree with him all the time because it's the ideology, the worldview that's the problem. It's just not true now at all because the interest rates are much higher and keep going higher.
And that's part of what happens in a stagflationary environment. That's one of the things that Greenspan said. He said the era of low interest rates is ending. He didn't say it's over today. It's ending. He said there's going to be a point in time. He said real long-term interest rates are much too low and unsustainable. We're experiencing a bubble, not in stocks, but in bonds. Rates are going to break higher. Break means a sharp rise. We've had 35 years, 36 years worth of falling interest rates since 1981. Bottom line is they're going to break higher. We're moving into a different phase, much higher interest rates in the next decade.
We'll take a break. We'll get some more phone calls. And, Jerry, I might keep you here a little bit longer because we have more to cover. So we'll see what we can do. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Confirmation hearings have been interesting of late. Some senators are asking questions of nominees that are more than tough, they're unfair. My favorite example of this came when Senator Cory Booker asked judicial nominee Naomi Rao whether she believed homosexuality is a sin. Now, that's a question that seems out of line because it invites the nominee to assert a theological pronouncement. Senator Mike Lee thought so, too. He said, "I can't fathom a circumstance in which it's ever appropriate for us to ask a nominee about his or her religious beliefs about whether X, Y, or Z is a sin." Senator Lee then had to remind Senator Mazie Hirono of Senator Booker's actual question about sin when Senator Hirono shot back, "It's not that we all ask, do you think such and such is a sin, etc., etc." These questions may, in fact, violate Article 6 of the Constitution, which guarantees that no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. Forcing citizens to adhere to a specific religious ideology, or none at all, violates the rights common to our humanity, rights endowed to us by our Creator. Article 6 exists to keep the halls of government open to an ideological variety of Americans. That's something our senators would do well to remember. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. Let me ask you, what if America's best attorneys from the very top law firms got together to defend religious freedom in court? That's exactly what's happening at First Liberty. And the best news? We're winning over 90% of our legal actions. Come learn more at firstliberty.org. You'll be encouraged. That's firstliberty.org.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Hi, this is Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. My story of Point of View really goes back to when I was in law school. I would listen to this show, and I was just blown away that there was actually a show that would analyze what was going on in our current world through a Christian worldview. It was something that stoked a fire in me early that turned out what I would be doing with my career for the Lord. So that's my story with Point of View, and I'd like to hear yours.
To share your story with Kelly and Kerby, you can call us at 800-347-5151, or you can do it online at pointofview.net/shareyourstory. If we share your story with the Point of View audience, we'll send you a Bible stick as our thank you. That number to call is 800-347-5151, or online at pointofview.net/shareyourstory.
And back once again, we've had a chance to hear Kelly Shackelford tell his story and many others, but we'd love to hear yours. And of course, in less than 2 weeks, we're going to be doing our Truth Team Week, and that's the time we'd like to share a few of those stories with some of our listeners. So if you'd like to share it with us, you can go to our website, pointofview.net, and there's a place where you can write your story out, or just, again, call that number. It's a different number than the on-air number, 800-347-5151. A couple of you have called in and shared your story, and we'd love to collect a few more as well. Let's go back to the phones and give a few more of you a chance to join our conversation. We're talking about the subject of debt, the impact that this could have on your finances and on the country. So we'll go to Missouri this time. Colin, what would you like to add to our conversation?
Yes, I wanted to say something about the debt. In the Bible, it calls it a bondman. You're in bondage to the numbers, and I want to say it this way: somebody thinks I hate anybody. I voted for Bill Clinton. I liked him, Brock too, and I voted for Donald Trump, and I love him. And when Brock got in, he had to bail out the banks and a whole bunch of people from going under, but he spoke truth. The man said he didn't want to do it, but it was going to put our children in bondage and our children's children in bondage to work all this debt off. I'm a grandfather, and when he said that, I knew that my grandchildren were going to be enslaved to the numbers, and they didn't have a choice to it. They put us in the debt that we're in. You say borrow from Social Security. Well, nobody told them they could borrow it, so
that's right. And we know who did
really
it.
Not the term.
Yeah. And let me jump in real quickly, because I, in the interest of time, I want to give everybody a chance to arrange and make some comments. But a key verse, and you might want to put this down or write it down, Proverbs 22:7. Proverbs 22:7. The rich rule over the poor, and the borrower is a servant to the lender. I think the better translation is the borrower is a slave to the lender.
Right.
And Colin is really right. When we do our Millennial Roundtable, which we did yesterday, we talk about the fact that we have dumped $22 trillion of debt on our children and our grandchildren. So then when you have individuals running for the presidency right now saying, well, let's just take and make Medicare for all, and the most conservative estimates are that would add an additional $32 trillion over 10 years on the backs of individuals. And that was estimate based on Bernie Sanders' original proposal. The bill that's in Congress right now actually expands to talk about things like dental and long-term care. So it's probably even more so. There's an upper limit, and we're getting pretty close to it, right?
Yeah, we're headed there. I mean, the numbers I gave earlier from Moody's said that by 2027, the amount of the interest is going to be 21.4% of all federal tax revenues. That's based on assumptions that things stay the way they are now. In other words, we're going to continue to grow the economy. Congress will not cut Medicare and Social Security, but that's not adding any of these left-wing goodies on, the left-wing lunacy goodies on top of that. If you add another 20, 30, 50, you're talking $100 trillion by the end of the decade. There's a point in which, and this is something two economists did a great job. They were chief economists for the International Monetary Fund. They wrote a book called This Time is Different. And, of course, it's tongue-in-cheek, because it's not different. 800 years of financial folly. They researched financial crises around the world for the last 800 years. And they said what happens is there's always a point in time. It's kind of like, was it Hemingway that said, they said, how did you go broke? He said, gradually and then suddenly, And so what happens is there's something called a bang moment.
Yeah.
The bang moment occurs when one day people are confident that you're going to pay your debts back, and the next day they're not.
Right.
And they shut off the credit. And what happens in a country, we don't know where that bang moment's going to occur, but there's a loss of confidence by other people that are, quote, lending us money, which means buying our government bonds and so forth, bonds, treasury bills. If they lose confidence in that and bang moment occurs, they go out. They vote with their feet and they move their money away. That's when you have a hyperinflationary crisis because there's no way to fund it other than printing press day and night and day, like nothing America's ever seen other than maybe the Confederacy and the Civil War, or maybe the Revolution War. We had a bunch of printing press that took place to fund our nation's birthing. But the bottom line is this is going to radically change our society.
And one of the things that sometimes people talked about is the debt bomb in America. But now Paul Samuelson's talking about a global debt bomb as well. And so there are some obvious action items. So maybe I can keep you over when we talk about some of those. But first of all, getting out of debt would be a really smart idea right now. So,
always
for the case. And of course, Bob was just sharing just a minute ago, Dan Seeley saying, well, get a nice pair of shoes because you'll have to wear them for a long period of time. Now, I think there's some other issues because, even during the Great Depression, even during stag-inflation in the 1970s, there were winners and losers.
Oh, yeah.
And it seems to me that Christians applying biblical principles about economics and finances are going to be a lot better off than individuals that simply are turning a blind eye. And when I started watching all of these individuals running for the nomination of the Democratic Party and the presidency, there are the highly visible individuals, but down below you also have people running for the Senate and for Congress. You are going to probably see some difference, I would hope, between what is in the Republican Party platform in 2020 and what's in the Democratic Party platform in 2020. But I'll guarantee you right now, hate to be blunt, I don't think either party is going to address the issues we're talked about right now. They're going to just sort of turn a blind eye to the debt and the deficit. And so it seems to me that wise and prudent Christians need to start thinking about what to do. So we come back from the break and we get into some of that.
You bet.
And let me just mention, too, that we do have a link to Jerry Tuma's organization. You can, of course, contact them off air. And one of the things I think is so helpful there is it just gives you an opportunity to go to Cornerstone Financial or to Cornerstone Report, and you're going to put some of these slides up there, right?
Yes.
And once you see those, you can say, okay, some of this isn't going to change no matter who we elect as president, although there is a difference. It's whether you go over the cliff slowly or whether you go over the cliff fast. But either way, we have some very difficult things to talk about in the future, and that's why we wanted to talk about them, if for no other reason than the fact that so often the mainstream press doesn't talk about this stuff.
Forewarned is forearmed. Kerby's an old saying, and wealth is not lost, it changes owners.
Yes.
So what you have to do, you want to be on the winning side of that, not on the losing side of that. And the losing side is going to be mostly traditional asset allocation type strategies because they worked in the most recent period of time, but it doesn't fit the future, in my opinion, in any way, shape, or form.
Sometimes the future cannot be predicted from the past unless you go, as you said, far enough back to the past to predict the future.
Right.
And so one of the reasons we like to have Jerry Tuma on is he is a little bit of a contrarian and recognizes that some of the things you're hearing from economists just don't hold true. If for no other reason, then they don't start from a biblical worldview.
Absolutely.
So I want to talk about kind of what a biblical view of economics and finances is when we come back from a break, and some suggested ideas and strategies that you can implement individually. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
It's amazing but true. When it comes to one of America's biggest household expenditures, healthcare, a lot of people think they've got no choice. People are used to thinking we have to do it this way, but they don't. Yes, you have the freedom to choose an alternative with your healthcare. It's MediShare, and it costs way less than the alternatives. The typical family saves $500 a month, not a year, a month. And if you're single, this can save you a lot too. And let's face it, a big reason MediShare is 400,000 people strong, it just works. They've shared over $3 billion in medical bills, so they can help share your needs too. Joining MediShare for so many people is one of those things that makes you say, why didn't I do this before? So yes, the time has come for something better. Look into joining MediShare and see why so many people are opting out of the old way and into the new. Why not look into this? Just call 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
It takes a team to win. Be part of Point of View's Truth Team and bring truth and healing to America. Go to pointofview.net/team, pointofview.net/team, and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
In studio with me for a little bit longer, Jerry Tuma, and we might keep him the entire hour. We'll just see how it goes. But if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. I know some of you may have some questions. And again, Jerry Tuma is the founder and president of Cornerstone Financial Services. And I just might mention that, again, we're probably going to be giving some general advice, but it's really intended for general information and should not be taken as specific investment, tax, or legal advice. But you can contact them. You're going to post some of these slides, which are a good analysis of the problem. We were getting into some of the solutions, but even before we get to the solutions, let's talk about how a Christian would view finance and investment differently. One of the things you've said on this program before, and it's helpful, is the traditional or secular way of looking at finances makes a presumption about the future. But the scriptures warn against that, doesn't it?
It does, yes. The James chapter 4 is probably the easiest one to call out on that, and that's James is talking in chapter 4. He says, "Don't say you're going to go in." This is rough paraphrase, as you know. Don't say you're going to go into such and such a city and buy or sell, but say if the Lord wills. You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Your life is just a vapor. The point is, and of course, Larry Burkett was one of my other mentors. I had three pretty high mentors, but he used that to talk about debt. We assume the future, and that's what usually gets people in trouble. You get to the top of the business cycle for your own industry or your earnings or whatever, and then you think you got it made, and so it's human nature. You tend to over-borrow, over-consume. You got this ebullient view of the world in the future, and you borrow money based on your current assumptions, but if the current assumptions fall out of bed,
that's right.
The economy falls out of bed, you lose your job, anything like that can happen, then you're presuming the future got you, as Colin said, enslaved, as a borrower, as servant to the lender. So step one is don't presume the future. We talk about in our book, which is out of print right now, Smart Money book, that what you should do is pray and ask the Lord, try to get emotionally neutral about big financial decisions, and then ask the Lord for wisdom. Because in James chapter 1, it says that where God gives you wisdom liberally. He doesn't upbraid you for asking for wisdom. And so you have to trust him because there's a condition of that. Don't be like the double-minded man it talks about there. The condition is that you ask in faith that God will give you wisdom to make the decision you need. That way you're submitting yourself as a steward of the Lord's money. You're under his lordship instead of being you in charge, which, of course, the world's way of doing is, bigger, better, best for you, and you're in charge and all that. Look out for number one, you name it kind of stuff. It's a radically different approach if you're looking at it as a steward and you're looking at it as, okay, my job is to submit to God's will because he knows best in the long run. He knows about my job in the future. He knows what the future entails. I don't. He has perfect foreknowledge into the future. So let me submit my wisdom to him, or my wisdom to God, my answers to God, and get his wisdom so that I make proper financial decisions.
One of the other principles is this idea of multiple streams of income, or separating or diversified. The old phrase, and I've used this before, put all your eggs in one basket and watch that basket, is not a biblical concept. Right. It's just the opposite in the scriptures, isn't it?
Yeah, and Solomon was not only the king, obviously a king, he was the wealthiest, maybe the wealthiest man that's ever lived, even today. I calculated his wealth one time using gold and using the amount of talents, because if you go into the Old Testament and Kings and so forth and Chronicles, it talks about the amount of wealth he had. His annual income just in the amount of gold that he got was like $666 million a year. That's when gold was $300 an ounce. So you're talking about someone who's making over $1 billion a year in personal income. They said silver was so common they didn't even pay any attention to it. They kind of threw it in the streets. So Solomon may have been the wealthiest man who ever lived. He was not just a king or politician in this case. He was also an investor. He had to manage the money, And so in Ecclesiastes, it says, chapter 11, it says, divide your assets into 7, yes, 8. Why? Because number one, you don't know which is going to do better, this or that, so you're diversifying. That's a biblical principle of investing. And number two, you don't know what disaster might befall the land. You don't want, if you were doing trading, back in those days, they traded with other nations in the Mediterranean and so forth. You don't want all your ship's cargo in one ship that could go down. So you never know what might happen. In this case, we're talking about a possible disaster coming with inflation, hyperinflation down the road. But again, diversification is a very important principle.
Yes. So let's talk about that. If indeed we think inflation's on the horizon, maybe not tomorrow. So, I mean, still the investments that people have right now, what they have in their bank accounts right now. But if they're looking long term, and they're, as you just pointed out a minute ago, or at least the last hour, you had somebody that had invested in bonds during inflation, and that didn't turn out to be a very good investment.
No, it didn't. Bonds are really bad when you have a hyperinflationary environment or even stagflation, because what you've done is you've locked in a long-term income stream. I mean, bonds can be, short-term bonds wouldn't be that bad in terms of inflation if it's 5 years or less. But people buy long-term muni bonds that may not mature for 20 or 30 or 40 years. They can buy long-term government bonds up to 30 years long. And so what happens is you're locking in an interest rate. We're at an historically low rate of interest right now. According to Bank Credit Analysts, which is one of our favorite research firms, they've analyzed yields in Great Britain, and they said that when we hit the lows in 2016, that was a 717-year low for interest rates. So I ask a lot of people when we do financial seminars, I said, if we hit a 717-year low on interest rates, what do you think the direction might be next?
Up.
It's not going to go back down more. So the direction for interest rates for the next 15, 20 years is going to be up. Well, what happens is if you lock in a bond now paying 3%, and in 5 years you need an equivalent bond has got to be 6%, then you've effectively lost close to half your money in the bonds. And people don't compute that. They're like, bonds? How can I lose money in bonds? I just hold on. Anyway, it's a long story. Bond mutual funds will be miserable during that time. So most people have not left. We had from the late 60s, mid to late 60s until 1981, bonds were a terrible investment for that entire time. A lot of people use them for retirement income. There's a lot of danger. I'm not talking about over the next year or two. I'm talking about over the next 10 to 15 years.
And so it's one of those things where if you had a long-term, for example, home interest loan and a mortgage, and the interest rates keep going up. I can remember a time when I told people that we had a 5% interest on our house, and everybody goes, wow. Now you say, they go, well, that's not very good. Well, there was a time when interest rates were 3 to 4.
15% interest on a mortgage back in the 80s.
And then 5% sounded pretty good. So we'll come back and talk a little bit more about that. But I also want to give some of you a chance to ask a question. Maybe you were just saying, what do I do if indeed we have the re-election of Donald Trump, or the election of whoever it might be, Kamala Harris or Cory Booker or Joe Biden or whoever it might be, Robert Francis O'Rourke. What does that look like? And if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. And again, if you want some of the material we're talking about today, we have a link to Cornerstone Financial, the Cornerstone Report, and you're going to post some of those pictures and those graphs. And if nothing else, it just helps you visually see some of the things we're talking about. And I think drives home the reason to begin to recognize that the future might not be the same. We all assume that the future is going to be just like the past. If anything, those of you that have lived through the last decades or two know that that is not the case. And Jerry Tuma is reminding us that the future might look more like the 1970s. And for those of you that are younger that never even lived during that, you might want to look at a history book or pay attention to some of the things we're talking about here today. So if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Love to hear your comments about debt, finance, spending, and investment. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
We're a divided country, but it may be worse than we imagined. An article in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences discussed what is called motive attribution asymmetry. That's a technical term for the assumption that your ideology is based in love and your opponent's is based on hate. Put another way, we're the good guys, they're the bad guys. They discovered that the average Republican and the average Democrat today are as divided as the Palestinians and Israelis. In his op-ed in the New York Times, Arthur Brooks says we see the other side as an enemy with whom one cannot negotiate or compromise. He comes to this startling conclusion. People often say that our problem in America is incivility or intolerance. He says that's incorrect. Motive attribution asymmetry leads to something far worse, contempt, which is a noxious brew of anger and disgust. And it is made worse by what he calls the outrage industrial complex that oftentimes caters to one side and criticizes the other. Now, when people hear about political conflicts, they often prescribe the wrong solutions. Just because we disagree doesn't mean we should put aside our disagreements. Arthur Brooks instead says that we need not disagree less. Instead, we need to disagree better. Whether we're discussing politics, economics, or philosophy, we should engage in a robust competition of ideas. We can disagree without being so disagreeable. So he suggests 2 steps. First, turn away from what he calls the rhetorical dope peddlers. These are powerful people on your side who are profiting from the culture of contempt. Second, make a commitment never to treat others with contempt. Christians should be civil and gracious. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Jerry Tuma with us, and let's take some more phone calls. We'll head out to California on KYCC. I think it's Carlene. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you for allowing me to kind of voice my opinion here.
Please do.
I had talked to the young man who answered the phone in the beginning, and this last week, I had a devotion that spoke about this very particular thing and how Proverbs 22:7 spoke to me and is a shocker for most people to understand that the Western culture, with easy credit and the desire for material goods and unwilling to save, are going to become a slave to their debt. Mm-hmm. So everything that we do individually can actually multiply because we're passing it on to the next generation.
Well said. You know, one of the chapters in my book is on consumerism and materialism, and I put that in there because we really, Carlene, need to get back to maybe a more frugal lifestyle. Most Christians are not giving what they should be giving to the church and God's work. Less than 10% of born-again Christians give 10%. So you can see we're in a bad situation there. Most Christians are in debt with credit card debt. Most of them are really out of their priorities. And what you're calling us to do is to go back and put our priorities back in line with Scripture, aren't you?
Amen. Yes, amen. Because of the fact that we are responsible for our own actions. That means decisions that we make. And I was blessed with a mother and father that was so diligent about teaching their children about everything you do has a consequence. It can either be a good one or a bad one.
Yes.
You need to understand that you're responsible for either case.
I would agree.
So make wise decisions and understand that everything you make can have a consequence. And I learned and grew up that I'm not in debt. I have never been in debt other than purchasing a house.
Which, again, is a good investment, actually. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute. It may be one of the better investments in an inflationary period. Carlene, I appreciate you calling because, you know, she really brought us back to some biblical principles, and it's been my frustration. You know, my commentary yesterday was on credit card debt. I didn't even know we were going to necessarily get into the issue of the credit card debt, but there's a good example. You know, if Christians are just as in debt as the non-Christian world, and if Christians are just as stressed out as non-Christians, and if Christian young people are living with their girlfriend or boyfriend and getting drunk just as often, the world looks and says, why do I want to know anything about Christianity? Because you don't look any different. But if Christians instead are using biblical principles about finance and human sexuality and have trust in the Lord, we're going to stand out in this culture, and that's an opportunity for evangelism, I think.
Very much so. I guess it's not as much always about witnessing as it is being a witness sometimes. And, you know, the issue is in the long run, and this is kind of a good way to segue into what I kind of want to talk about here.
Right.
You and I are real familiar with the term humanism. You know, humanism is a atheistic philosophy they've invented. It really started with the ancient Greeks, but it got picked up and taken with the, you know, all the deism and all the fun things that happened with the French Revolution in Europe, and that's what the liberals, you know, mindset's made up of, is what the Western Europeans have been teaching for all this time. The problem is that it works, again, like the proverb says, there's a way that seemeth right unto a man, but the end thereof is death, and D-E-A-T-H, death. We didn't even talk about the impact of abortion on all this stuff.
Oh, yeah, we forgot about that.
The bottom line is that there is a huge problem with the fact that our culture has taught everybody to live for today, just enjoy life forever. And there's nothing wrong with having fun. Obviously, God's got a good sense of humor too. But the point is, if we follow the Bible, those are more or less long-term guaranteed ways of success. Doesn't mean short-term success. Doesn't mean we won't go through tribulation. You know, we've been through a lot of tribulation. I'm sure you have too, Kerby. But the bottom line is, especially for a society, we started in America as a nation that has really encoded biblical principles into our foundation more than any other nation in the history of the planet. And, of course, the left-wing guys, the humanists and the atheists and all those guys have been steadily steering us off course as far as they can get us away from that for the last, 100-plus years. And it's a part of the media, it's part of the education system and so forth. So that's one of the reasons why we look like the world and act like the world typically, because that's everything we've been fed. Kind of like Zig Ziglar once said, are you going to feed the white dog or the black dog? The guy, the old story, you probably know it. They had this dog fight every week, and somehow or other the owner of the dogs always knew which one to bet on the white dog or the black dog. And finally they asked the old man, he said, how do you know which one of these is going to win? They're equally matched dogs. He said, well, I just bet on the one that I feed that week. And so as Christians, if we feed the flesh and we feed bad stuff, we're going to lose the battle. If we feed the things of the Spirit, we're going to win the battle and the Word of God. So bottom line is there's a radical departure in our society, but what's going to happen is we have reaped a lot. We've sown a lot. We're going to reap a whirlwind in a lot of ways with all this stuff that we've been sowing in our society. And in the long run, it does produce death, financially and every other way.
All right, we didn't mention that one, but it's your last slide here. And here is the population curve. And what you actually do is take us through, the fact that you had kind of a baby boom, then you had kind of a baby bust, then you had this other boomlet, which was the millennials.
Right.
But you actually have in this chart where we would be if we had not aborted so many individuals. And you think about some of the issues we're addressing here right now, Social Security and Medicare. Let's just take those two. When you started Social Security, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt started Social Security, you had almost 40 workers paying into one recipient. By the time you got to the 1950s, because they expanded, it was still about 10 to 1, 5 to 1, now 3 to 1. But it's eventually going to be less than 2 to 1. We've never forced an entire population to fund the future retirement.
Right.
And again, this one we aren't going to change because those babies we aborted are gone.
That's right.
And so part of the consequences we're going to have to live with because of sins in the past. Is that fair?
Absolutely. Yeah. Funding Social Security and Medicare, and a lot of times when I speak, people go, well, I resent you calling Social Security entitlement because I've been paying into the system all these years. I'm like, that's true, but if you'd been investing your money with Bertie Madoff for 20 years, and what did you end up at the end of the day? Social Security is a Ponzi scheme. It is basically an unfunded liability. Even Alan Greenspan said that. Bernanke said that, meaning it's pay as you go. In other words, the money comes in, we pay it in for our taxes. Those of us that are working, it pays for the people that are currently getting the benefit. The problem is if you continue to proliferate all these kind of programs all over, and Carlene mentioned responsible for our own actions. No, we have a victim mentality in America sometimes. And so we're not responsible. Of course we are, but the bottom line is if we have that kind of mentality build up and everything's free lunch from the government, then guess what? It all blows up again because the debt just goes skyrocketing. So if we had not aborted, last time I checked, I think there were 65 million-ish babies, then we wouldn't be having such a big problem for the future with funding Social Security and Medicare.
They'd be producing those
They'd be making income. They'd be producing taxes.
They might even have found the cure to cancer. They might have been one of the great poets. We don't even know. But the reality is that you are forcing the smaller generation in terms of numbers to fund this massive generation now going into Social Security and Medicare. So
and God said in his word to be fruitful and multiply multiple times in Genesis. He never took it back. He didn't get to Revelation and go, oh no, the world's overpopulated, so we have to stop having babies. God never said that. And so there's nothing in the Bible that says we need to encourage a zero population philosophy. That's just basically an invention of man. And so you've got a reaping and sowing, and it's not just in America, Kirby. Europe is in the same boat.
Even worse.
Even worse, and
Much
Japan
worse.
as well.
Much
So
worse,
the
yes.
industrialized nations, they're going to have a reaping problem with the future because, again, Japan is actually shrinking. How do you have in the long run, how do you have prosperity when more people die than are born every year?
Yeah.
That can't work. So the problem is all this, again, emanated from the atheistic, humanistic, and teaching that permeated the school systems, permeates the media today, getting more radical and more fire-breathing every second of the day. We got to go back to biblical principles.
When we come back, let's talk about a couple more wise investments. We've talked about some that don't work. Talked about the bond market. Talked about real estate a little bit. We'll get into a couple of others. And if you have some more questions, 1-800-351-1212. But again, I appreciate Carlene reminding us, as of course all of us have, around the table, Proverbs 22:7, the rich rule over the poor, and the borrower is a servant, probably better translated, a slave of the lender. Get out of slavery, that's an obvious first step, but we'll talk about some other strategies right after this.
It's amazing but true. When it comes to one of America's biggest household expenditures, healthcare, a lot of people think they've got no choice. People are used to thinking we have to do it this way, but they don't. Yes, you have the freedom to choose an alternative with your health care. It's MediShare, and it costs way less than the alternatives. The typical family saves $500 a month, not a year, a month. And if you're single, this can save you a lot too. And let's face it, a big reason MediShare is 400,000 people strong, it just works. They've shared over $3 billion in medical bills, so they can help share your needs too. Joining MediShare for so many people is one of those things that makes you say, why didn't I do this before? So yes, the time has come for something better. Look into joining MediShare and see why so many people are opting out of the old way and into the new. Why not look into this? Just call 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
It takes a team to win. Be part of Point of View's Truth Team and bring truth and healing to America. Go to pointofview.net/team, pointofview.net/team, and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Jerry Tuma with us for a little bit longer, and if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Talking about debt, talking about entitlements, talking about what this might mean in the future, and even if you don't understand what the word stagflation is, you've got a couple of very good PowerPoint diagrams and illustrations and definitions of that, as well as just some great material that I would recommend. And again, people can go to your website, Cornerstone Report, and find some of that. But let me take one of the callers who couldn't stay on the line, but this was a listener who said, if nothing is done to get rid of the national debt, what is the expected outcome? And that assumes that nothing will be done. I think that's unfortunately a pretty fair assumption, given the fact that you haven't had anybody in the Obama administration, now the Trump administration, and whether you have a re-election of President Donald Trump or the election of a President Kamala Harris or Joe Biden or whoever that might be, somewhere along the line, you got to pay the piper. What's going to happen?
Yeah, I mean, you look at our lifetime, Kirby, you and I are both in our 60s. Has federal spending ever gone down over the long run? It ratchets up and up and up and up. And every time you have a recession, it ratchets a whole lot higher. But again, the radical left's gotten a lot crazier, and so they're proposing a lot more bad stuff if you want to do it. And everybody's just kind of forgotten about the debt. Oh, well, it hasn't bitten us yet, so we're ignoring it. Politically, you know, when you have a 2-year election cycle, there's no incentive for short-term pain for long-term gain. So there's more incentive to give stuff away. Kind of like, again, the Andrew Tyler Frazier quote. You know, he said, democracies are not I can't talk today. Democracies are not a permanent form of government, one that's temporary. Why? Because eventually the populace decides it can vote itself benefits out of the Treasury. And then it's destroyed ultimately by loose fiscal policy. That means printing money, spending more than you take in. So the issue is, if this continues, and I don't see a way to turn it around, frankly, and I don't want to be a fatalist. I'm an optimist by nature. Then what you eventually do is you end up with a crisis, a magnitude crisis that could be Great Depressionary in terms of how much it affects people, but it will be different. The 30s was a deflationary crisis. This will be an inflationary crisis, and I think the likelihood is high. You know, Larry Burkett, again, was one of my mentors. He got it right with his book called The Coming Economic Earthquake, but his timing was way off. But ultimately, if you look at what he said in the book, it's proving to be very accurate. And everything that he said, you know, because he thought it was going to start by the year 2000. Well, if you look at what he wrote in that book, it's still happening today. But the bottom line is the federal government is runaway control, out of control, and it eventually causes an inflationary crisis. When that occurs, rampant inflation is taking place. You know, the most extreme examples, again, like the Weimar Republic after World War I, the prices, and they didn't put prices on the restaurant. You go into the restaurant, there was no price on the restaurant food. Why? Because the price went up as you sat there. You know, they went to the grocery stores, and they didn't have a price on the food. They had a unit number, and you didn't know what the price was going to be until you got the cash register to multiply the unit number times the current price. And so that's the most extreme example. That in Zimbabwe and places in Venezuela, places like that where inflation's, you know, in the thousands of percent, it might not get to that point, but it also could, especially what happens if we have all this debt we've accumulated. And again, you know, I'm a fan of the Fourth Turning. It's a book I think everybody should read. What if we have a massive war of some sort? What if terrorism causes big wars in America's future? I think that's very reasonable that you could assume that at some point. Then that blows the debt numbers just literally off the charts. So, again, you've got to be optimistic because wealth is not lost, it changes owners. But the issue is there are ways to prosper in any kind of economic environment, but you got to be ready for the future, not holding on to the past.
So there are just some things that are hedges against inflation. What might those be?
Well, if you look at the inflation in the 70s, Kirby, gold did well. Gold's probably the best, and I'm not one of these gold bugs that's, you know, everything has to be in gold and the world's Chicken Little, the sky's falling continuously. But if you look at what prospered in the 1970s, gold did extremely well, maybe the best pure inflation hedge, period. Silver, not as much. Land would be another one. Real estate, most real estate does very well in inflationary times. Some does better than others. The best thing for in terms of inflation would be hotels because they can raise rates up to daily. You know, we like storage facilities. They can raise it monthly. And some types of real estate have extremely long-term leases where you don't get rent escalators. The worst of all in terms of the real estate would be if you're in an area where the left has taken over and they pass rent controls, you're toast. Because rent controls will destroy wealth because you can't raise rents as inflation goes up. In the Weimar Republic I mentioned earlier, corporations got tanked, the stock market tanked, but land, jewels, precious metals did extremely well. Real estate that had a lot of, the wannabes or the renters tend to outnumber the landlords, and so they get the politicians to pass rent controls. And that's happened in many areas of our country. But if you have rent controls with hyperinflation going on, it just destroys it. The places get abandoned. So you got to be careful. You really want to know where you live.
Yeah.
Because you want to be in a red state, not a blue state.
And again, we should recognize that inflation's always been going up, but it's been hidden in the past. Yeah. But when it's going up so obviously, you have to change your mindset. And so again, one of the things I would say is as a Christian, it is sometimes helpful to just be a good student of history and to go back and look at what happened in the 1970s is certainly something that would give you some indication of what that might look like. And it may not be happening tomorrow, but I notice even one of your charts here talks a little bit about even the idea of inflation in the next time in which whoever is president from 2020 to 2030. There have been people talking about some kind of collapse that could happen in 2030. We are also talking about whether or not Medicare itself would collapse. And there's only one or two options. Back to our question here of what do you see happening? Either the government doesn't have enough money, and then we don't pay Social Security benefits, Medicare benefits.
Never happen,
yeah,
right?
Which is a theoretical possibility. Or the other issue is simply to spend some time recognizing that maybe inflation is going to take place. And as you point out, there have been people during the 1970s, during the time of inflation, that did fairly well. So to really understand the signs of the times.
Absolutely.
Which is another kind of biblical phrase.
It is.
Let's take another phone call real quickly here. And we'll go to Georgia, WLPE. Marcella, thank you for calling today. What's your question?
How are you?
I am well.
Let's see. Me too. God bless you. Okay. I'm a state employee. Well, I can say, I'm trying to manage my money as much as I can. I don't have any debt. My car has been paid off in less than 2 years.
Good for you. You're doing well.
I don't owe any money. Yeah. Thank the Lord. But I'm hearing about the hyperinflation and all these different things, the prices rising and stuff. And I'm 62.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, what do I expect? What to expect? Does that make sense?
It does. There are a lot of people just saying, look, I'm just living hand to mouth, or, the question that a lot of people have had is, she's 62. She might say, well, is Social Security going to be there when I retire? And the answer is yes, but it's going to be funded not out of the Social Security Trust Fund that was set aside.
Right.
It's going to be funded out of the government trying to figure out a way to raise revenue. And they could start selling off federal land and maybe make some money that way.
Right.
And Michael Ferris has talked about that possibility. And so there might be some ways in which the federal government would fund it without necessarily hyperinflation. So there is that theoretical possibility, but otherwise you just have to start saying, how would they pay for her so that she can get Social Security, she can get Medicare, or anyone else of her age? And that's why I think the reasonable assumption, and again, we always reserve the right to change our minds later on if something changes we haven't seen, is that they would have to print money. And when you start printing the money, when you have more money chasing the same number of goods, what that means is that's called inflation. And that means that the dollars in your purse or your wallet each day are worth a little bit less. And so that's kind of the issue.
And essentially, Solomon said there's nothing new under the sun. Everything that's happened has happened before. And it's not just the 70s we have as a principle to follow. It's the Revolutionary War, the Confederate War in America, and the 70s. But it's also 800 years of recorded monetary history. Every time a country or nation or civilization, go back to the Ming Dynasty even, back in the 600 BC, or AD rather, they would finance this stuff by printing money. And then, of course, you didn't stay around. Marco Polo thought it was great. He didn't stick around to see the emperor lose his head when they had hyperinflation a few years later. So I realize we're coming up to a break. But don't operate out of fear, Marcella.
No,
That's
if nothing
last
else.
thing I can say.
And again, that's where I think we need trust in the Lord. And I think it's also where we need to have some Christians like you. We mentioned Dan Celia and a few others that have talked about this. Larry Burkett years ago. So we're just coming back to some of those biblical principles of finance. We'll come back For more, right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Confirmation hearings have been interesting of late. Some senators are asking questions of nominees that are more than tough, they're unfair. My favorite example of this came when Senator Cory Booker asked judicial nominee Naomi Rao whether she believed homosexuality is a sin. Now, that's a question that seems out of line because it invites the nominee to assert a theological pronouncement. Senator Mike Lee thought so too. He said, "I can't fathom a circumstance in which it's ever appropriate for us to ask a nominee about his or her religious beliefs about whether X, Y, or Z is a sin." Senator Lee then had to remind Senator Mazie Hirono of Senator Booker's actual question about sin when Senator Hirono shot back, "It's not that we all ask, do you think such and such is a sin, etc., etc." These questions may in fact violate Article 6 of the Constitution, which guarantees that no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. Forcing citizens to adhere to a specific religious ideology, or none at all, violates the rights common to our humanity, rights endowed to us by our Creator. Article 6 exists to keep the halls of government open to an ideological variety of Americans. That's something our senators would do well to remember. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. Let me ask you, what if America's best attorneys from the very top law firms got together to defend religious freedom in court? That's exactly what's happening at First Liberty. And the best news? We're winning over 90% of our legal actions. Come learn more at firstliberty.org. You'll be encouraged. That's firstliberty.org.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Hi, this is Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. My story of Point of View really goes back to when I was in law school. I would listen to this show, and I was just blown away that there was actually a show that would analyze what was going on in our current world through a Christian worldview. It was something that stoked a fire in me early that turned out what I would be doing with my career for the Lord. So that's my story with Point of View, and I'd like to hear yours.
To share your story with Kelly and Kerby, you can call us at 800-347-5151, or you can do it online at pointofview.net/share-your-story. If we share your story with the Point of View audience, we'll send you a Bible stick as our thank you. That number to call is 800-347-5151 or online at pointofview.net/share-your-story.
Back once again, and again, we'd love to hear your story, and you can find out a little bit more about that on our website, pointofview.net. I've kept Jerry Tuma here 2 hours. I hope he doesn't mind, but even as we've been going through this, I was just thinking, even Marcella was sort of saying, well, what do I do? And it kind of relates to something we talked about this time last week, and that is we had the producer of the Patterns of Evidence film. The first one was on the Exodus, this most recent one on Moses controversy. But in that, you have the story about Joseph. And what was the story of Joseph? Well, you had 7 years of plenty, then you had 7 years of what? Famine. And it does seem to me that right now, and I come back to the last interview we did with you, Jerry, is that you were talking about the Goldilocks and the Three Bears.
Right.
Right now, the economy is doing better.
Right.
We have 3% growth, or a little less than 3% growth. The tax cuts have helped. And I think for a period of time, this might be those years of plenty. Now, some people that are in debt might say it doesn't feel like it, but, look ahead to what might happen.
Right.
And again, we can't necessarily presume on the future. We've already talked about that.
Right.
But right now, we have the opportunity maybe set some money aside or to make some prudent investments. Most importantly, if you're in debt right now, if there is one action item I would leave to our listeners, get out of debt, because that's going to be really important. But at the same time, eventually, some of these things we've talked about will kick into place. They may not kick into place until after the next presidential election. Well, that's a year and a half from now. But sometime or other, you're going to have more and more difficulty on the part of the federal government to meet its needs, to meet the needs of Social Security and Medicare. What are they going to do then? Especially if you have even a very leftist type of president, they're going to hit the gas. I'm not necessarily suggesting that President Donald Trump is going to hit the brakes, but I am saying that he might only have the foot on the accelerator a little bit. But if you elect an individual that is totally oblivious to some of the things we've talked about, they're going to floor it, and you're going to even see the problem more so. And so it tells me that if nothing else, people need to go to your website. It's cornerstonereport.com. They can see the Goldilocks and the Three Bears piece. And you're going to post this one as well about stagflation and some of that, just to make prudent decisions about this. But don't you think that right now, when we have a relatively good economy, the median family income is increased, most people have a job, and that even wages seem to be going up somewhat, this is the time to make good, sound economic decisions, but not assume that the future is going to be like it is right today.
Absolutely, yeah. Optimism by consumers is very high right now. The unemployment rate is the lowest it's been in 50-some-odd years. So, yes, in a lot of ways, we're having sort of a boom. It's not, I've seen bigger booms, but this is still a really good boom with the tax cuts, the deregulation. So Trump's done everything he could. Now, he's not tackling the entitlements, and I think part of that may be by design, just from the standpoint he knows it's politically impossible. I don't know if that's his view or not, but I do know that fixing the economy, that's one of the things we talked about in our book, From Boom to Bust and Beyond, and part 2, Preparing for the Springtime, was small business explosion, which has been happening, all these things that we need to do to fix the economy. You want to grow your way out of this as much as you can. However, if you're continuing to pile up debts, which the left, if they do, they're just going to hyper-accelerate things, then that eventually, that's the death knell to capitalism unless something's done about it. So we've got to prepare for both times, not just where we are today. We've got to look further down the road to what's going to happen in the future. And again, I would look at these entitlement programs, just go, I just don't see any chance that they're going to cut these programs. I don't see any chance that the federal debt's going to get under control. And I do know a lot about monetary history of the world. And I do know, like I mentioned, Marco Polo came back when he was, Ming Dynasty or whoever it was, 1200, I think it's 1200 AD. And he found some great things the Chinese had invented. They invented paper money. They invented spaghetti, which, became spaghetti in Italy.
Yeah.
What is it?
Chow
mein, noodles.
Yeah.
Anyway, gunpowder. He found all these wonderful things when he started the Silk Road. But the problem with the paper money deal was he never stood around. He never waited around long enough to see what happened. What would happen would be that every time they'd start out with good intentions, okay, we won't tax people too much, we won't promise too many goodies, and all of a sudden, well, now we're getting backlash from people on the taxes, so let's just print a little bit of extra money to cover all these things we want to give away to the population. And for a while it was okay, because it didn't produce rampant inflation until it got out of control. And it usually took an average of about 60 years to get out of control. And then the next thing you know is the paper money's worthless, the empire corrodes and falls, and then again they chop the head off that dynasty and put another one in. So I'm not saying it's going to get that extreme in America, but you can't rule out the fact that it might. So therefore, again, forewarned is forearmed. I think we need to plan on some sort of big inflation in the next decade, and probably a financial crisis with the U.S. government. As a matter of fact, that's why Standard & Poor's downgraded us from AAA to AA, and that's been almost a decade ago. The problem is if we hit that bang moment I talked about earlier where our foreign creditors stop believing in us, like China, for example, and stop investing over here, then we've got real issues. So I don't want to be doom and gloom or pessimistic again. Wealth is not lost, it changes owners, but big changes are coming, and you're better off to get ready for them.
Well, and if nothing else, as I've said before, if the United States were a separate country and they wanted to join with the European Union, which we wouldn't, but just as hypothetically, because our debt load is so high, they wouldn't accept us. So it's just because the United States is the United States that we sort of get away with some of this.
For a while.
For a while. And that's kind of the point. Well, if people want to know more, they might be saying, okay, I've got to really kind of get my head around this. I'd like to see the slides. I'd like to talk to you. They can go to Cornerstone Report, and they can also call you, can't
What
they?
I might do, we've got our Saturday radio show that'll be posted on there next week. I may just try to use some of this material on the radio.
Perfect.
On this week's program, and that'll make it easy for people. They can just tune in and hear the whole show.
So again, that's Smart Money Radio, and that takes place every Saturday. So we'll give you that opportunity as well. And we started out with the idea that we just wanted to alert people to this issue. I don't want people to make decisions on the basis of fear.
No.
But at the same time, I still think a great illustration is Joseph.
Yep.
I mean, there was a time in
Absolutely.
which, God had revealed to him, and we're not saying that we have any revelation from God at all, but we can be students of history saying these might be some times of plenty. Right now, this is a time to make some financial decisions that are wise so that later on, if this doesn't take place, I don't see how it gets avoided, but if it doesn't take place, well, what have you lost?
You're still better off.
You got money in the bank, you're out
Right.
of debt. But if it does, you're forewarned, and you'll have an opportunity to have a testimony before others that say, how did you know this was
Believe it or
coming?
not, wealth creation, but not from, it's all for me kind of perspective, but for God's kingdom. Wealth creation is how we need to think over the next decade.
I think so. Well, again, Jerry, thanks for being with us today, and we'll do this again because if nothing else, we recognize these are some issues that the mainstream media is not talking about, so that's why we're talking about it here on Point of View. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for the help behind the scenes. Tomorrow is our Friday weekend edition, so we'll see you back here tomorrow right here on Point of View.
It's amazing but true. When it comes to one of America's biggest household expenditures, healthcare, a lot of people think they've got no choice. People are used to thinking we have to do it this way, but they don't. Yes, you have the freedom to choose an alternative with your healthcare. It's MediShare, and it costs way less than the alternatives. The typical family saves $500 a month, not a year, a month. And if you're single, this can save you a lot too. And let's face it, a big reason MediShare is 400,000 people strong, it just works. They've shared over $3 billion in medical bills, so they can help share your needs too. Joining MediShare for so many people is one of those things that makes you say, why didn't I do this before? So yes, the time has come for something better. Look into joining MediShare and see why so many people are opting out of the old way and into the new. Why not look into this? Just call 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
It takes a team to win. Be part of Point of View's Truth Team and bring truth and healing to America. Go to pointofview.net/team, pointofview.net/team, and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because